Hello, this is Patrick Barnard in Montreal. It is Friday, June 13, 2025. There's all sorts of extraordinary and terrible things happening in the world. But this week, the International Press Review will look at the dominance of the US dollar. Is the US dollar in danger of losing its hegemony in the world? Well, probably not, but it's certainly shaky. So we're going to look at a series of different economic views. The first is that of Kenneth Rogoff. He's famous for a book called This Time is Different, which studied financial crises over time. And he's now written a new book about the US dollar. He published a recent op-ed piece in the Financial Times, and we're going to take a look at that. That will be our first view of the US greenback. I'm looking at the Kenneth Rogoff opinion piece right now in the Financial Times, but 6 days ago. America's fiscal policy is going off the rails, and nobody seems to want to fix it. He's an expert in inflation and debt crises. He says that in the United States, governments have been able to pay for these crises, but voters have not wanted to make sacrifices. That is his view. He points to the 120% of GDP national debt, also the budget deficits, chronic budget deficits, running at about 6.5% of GDP. He says different things in this piece. On the one hand, the Americans want to preserve their global economic hegemony for another 100 years. At the same time, he stresses that China is decoupling from U.S. financial markets. And the piece ends with this judgment. The U.S.'s high debt will be a major amplifier of the next crisis. And in most scenarios, the American economy and the dollar's global status will be the losers. One of the facts that Kenneth Rogoff mentions in his op-ed piece is that long-term U.S. Treasury rates have moved up to 4.5%. That's unusual because the dollar has been going down, the U.S. dollar. And normally, long-term interest rates would also go down in parallel, but the opposite is occurring. Why is that taking place? A couple of very bright reporters at the Financial Times, Katie Martin and Gillian Tett, have indicated over the last several months that money is moving out of long-term Treasury bills in the United States. It's not an enormous amount, but it's telling. For example, Gillian Tett was told by a very significant Canadian pension fund manager that the fund was moving some amount of money out of the US dollar. That fund, in all likelihood, was either the Caisse de dépôt of Quebec or the Ontario Teachers' Plan. The movement of very big money away from the dollar does not mean that the dollar is crashing. What it means is that people are hedging their bets. And you can see here in this graph that gold now is the second major reserve for central banks in the world after the dollar. That's a significant event. What is going on now in 2025 is a significant movement in the whole history of the US dollar after World War II. This is the fourth such moment in the saga. The first act in the story was the establishment of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
The Bretton Woods Conference created what came to be known as the Bretton Woods system. The dollar was going to be the world reserve currency. It was pegged to gold at the price of $35 for an ounce of gold. Other countries would use the dollar as their reserve currency. The head of the British delegation was John Maynard Keynes, a man who had written that famous book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he argued that the imbalances, the trade imbalances around the time of the First World War led to terrible difficulty. He was right then. At Bretton Woods, he wanted to create an ICU, an international clearing union, with a world currency, which was going to be called the Bancor. Well, Keynes did not win that argument. The Americans won the argument and made their currency officially the world reserve currency. The second act in this story of the post-World War II reign of the US dollar came in 1971 in the summer, when Richard Nixon suddenly and unilaterally decided to unpeg the dollar. It would no longer be pegged to gold itself, $35 an ounce. Instead, the dollar would float, and the world entered a regime of floating currencies. It was no longer the same kind of situation.
The sound of a television broadcast crackles through American living rooms on a summer Sunday evening. It's August 15th, 1971, and millions of Americans sit stunned as President Richard Nixon announces a series of economic measures that will fundamentally alter the global financial system. With calm determination in his voice, Nixon declares, "I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interests of the United States."
After 1971, the United States was still the preeminent reserve currency in the world. Everybody did their business in dollars, and everything went along like that until 1985 and what was known as the Plaza Accord, when the United States and its principal commercial allies decided collectively to devalue the dollar. Why did they do that? Because when you have the world reserve currency, there's a kind of privilege that comes with it. Everyone else has to earn their dollars, have a trade surplus to be able to earn dollars. You can print your own national currency and do business in that way. The United States began to run trade deficits. And the other thing is that everybody was doing their business in money. So that kept the dollar rather high and also did not spur competitiveness for U.S. industries. So the decision was taken collectively to deliberately devalue the dollar.
The Plaza Accord was a major financial agreement reached on September 22, 1985, by 5 leading industrialized countries: the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Named after New York City's Plaza Hotel, where the deal was signed, its primary goal was to lower the value of the US dollar, which had become overly strong throughout the early 1980s.
Then, after the Plaza Accord in 1985, and particularly the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the world entered a new era. It was what you might call the era of neoliberalism. Capitalism was the only system in the world, with variations, of course. It was a world built in the image of the United States. But lo and behold, one of the things that happened with the spread of the capitalist system is that the Chinese people were very good at capitalism. It was different, but they were excellent at it. And they competed very successfully with the United States. And suddenly, the United States looked at that world it had created with its money, in its image, and decided that it did not like the image it saw.
I don't want companies leaving our country, making their product, selling it back, no tax, no nothing, firing everybody in our country. We're not letting that happen anymore, folks, believe me.
Under Trump 2.0, the United States has suddenly, abruptly turned against the very economic world that it made. Back in 1944, it did not want John Maynard Keynes's International Clearing Union. It wanted King Dollar, and King Dollar was what it got. But now the consequences of this kind of world really disturbs people in the United States. Why? Because China, in some domains, is outcompeting the United States, and not just China. There are two people in the United States and the Trump administration who are most important in creating the architecture of the new tariff policies: Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, and a man called Stephen Miran, who is the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. And here in my lap is Miran's seminal essay, as they say, A User's Guide to Restructuring the World Trading System. This is a very important document. What Bessent and Miran are trying to do is to set up tariff walls, make people leap over them to invest in the United States, to combat the dual deficits, and to do so by deliberately lowering the value of the dollar and making other people revalue their currencies. This is being done in an extremely aggressive way, and Miran likes to call his set of proposals the Mar-a-Lago Accord, echoing the Plaza Accord, but there's extraordinary elements in here.
I'm not too concerned about Donald Trump not understanding how his tariffs work because he's Donald Trump. He doesn't understand how to make money running a casino. The important thing is that there are adults in the room, like Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary and college dean, who understands that boys will be boys. That guy's going to have the answers we need.
What do you expect the stock market to look like when it opens tomorrow in reaction to this?
I don't know.
Should we view these as permanent?
I think we're going to wait and see how this plays out.
Do you plan on having negotiations before that date?
I just don't know if there are going to be negotiations.
Canada and Mexico notably missing on that chart. Why is that?
I'm not sure.
Peculiar ideas in this thinking include attacking, punishing your competitors and your rivals, but at the same time seeking their cooperation and completely reordering the financial system of the world and making the dollar go down and other currencies come up in a very delicate way. Miran himself in his document admits that his proposals are risky and that there's a very narrow path using economic policy in this way. There's also proposals to coerce people to shift from short-term bonds into long-term bonds, century bonds as they're known. Also, there's obviously a hint at taxing people who invest in U.S. capital markets. All this has spooked the world, and the world sees the United States now as unpredictable and unreliable. And that is not good for the results that Mr. Miran and Mr. Bessent want to bring about.